You're listening to The First Question with Paul Hendrick, brought to you by Ballistic Sports. Follow Ballistic Sports on Twitter at Ballistic Sports.
Hockey has made incredible strides. What was once a male-dominated sport has now seen women's involvement make quantum leaps. And with Kim St. Pierre's entry into the Hall in 2020, 8 women will now take their rightful place within the shrine. The fact is, there should be more. Former national team goaltender Sami Jo Small provides a unique perspective in her newly released book, The Role I Played, Canada's Greatest Olympic Hockey Team. Sami, the book takes us deep into Hockey Canada, as seen through your eyes, your triumphs and your heartbreaks. It felt like a roller coaster tug of emotion. Has the book helped balance those incredible peaks and valleys as you reflect back on what was a great career?
Well, Paul, it certainly was cathartic writing it. Having lived the moments, there's often times where perspective is really important. And so 20 years later, going through all these stories, it was certainly hard. I had to relive the stories over and over as you're going through every edit. And oftentimes I would, my husband would think he was in trouble because, I was angry or I was upset. And in my mind, it was like I just got pulled from a game. And that was at times could be hard. But it also gave me the value of putting myself in that position, but also seeing it from the coach's eyes, from other teammates' eyes, and seeing it now as a middle-aged woman, looking back at what I thought, was important at the time, and certainly was for me then. Now knowing the incredible lessons and the valuable people that I got to meet along the way that just have superseded all of the negative emotions. So I wanted to write it from that perspective of being there and bring the reader along the journey with us. But it certainly taught me a lot about myself and how I reacted to situations, and hopefully can share with the reader, situations that they have gone through in their lives that are very similar. Despite the fact that this might be at the Olympic level, I think it's really the human journey that we all go on.
Yeah, for anyone who gets to where you got to and achieve, you're always looking over your shoulder. There's always someone there to replace you. And the fact of the matter is, the process is rather cold. That struck out to me, and some great players along the way received the same message you did at one point in your careers. No one's an exception, with maybe Wick and a few others, but that's it.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the book near the end, only Geraldine Heaney and Cassie Campbell retired, in my opinion, when they wanted to. And everybody else, you're unceremoniously cut. You're unceremoniously told that somebody else is going to be in your spot. And that's not easy. Even somebody like Hayley Wickenheiser, it's not easy to not feel valued, and it now, having been a GM, being a mother, there are times when you have to be cold, and I suffered it from the athlete's perspective, but never thought about what the coaches or administrators were going through. It can't have been easy for them. As a GM, having to either fire or cut people was the most terrible part about my job. I mean, it was so hard. You carry that weight with you, no matter if you do it in a positive or a negative way. It doesn't matter. That athlete is devastated. And I certainly was devastated. But I never saw those people as real people. I think it's like our teachers. We just assume that they don't go home to a family. They're not real people, but they were. And it's been interesting having, written this book. I sent the manuscript to the coaches that are profiled in the book, because they often aren't profiled very well. They are the villains of the story, but I wanted them to know the respect and admiration I had for them. So I sent it to them and gave them the first right of refusal for anything that was in there. But it also, in those conversations, and we talked for hours and hours over the manuscript, learning so much more about what it took for them to be able to coach in that situation. 2 of the female coaches, Danielle Sauvageau and Mel Davidson, both were the first at what they were doing. They in their small towns were female coaches in a male-dominated sport. Both were having to deal with our team as Team Canada, perhaps being not seen on the same value, even within Hockey Canada. So, always having to fight for our team, fight for the players, I never saw any of that because I only saw the decisions they were making towards me or maybe to my teammates and my friends. We didn't see the bigger picture. So that's been a really interesting process for me is, learning the other side of it. All the cogs and all the moving parts that were part of this dynasty has been a real intriguing part of having written this book as well for me. And I'm so glad that I did because it makes me look back with fondness now. And I would say that there's times playing that I didn't have that. I felt, you feel bitter, you feel mad that you've been cut. I mean, you don't think of all the good things. You think of that one moment where your time is up. But every athlete goes through that, and it's no different in the workplace environment or even as a parent. Your kids move out and no longer valued. And how do you find that value again? How do you think of the good times rather than that one moment?
In your career, you put team above everything else. Your close friends were also your biggest rivals. Shannon Sabato, Charlene Labonte, of course, Kim St. Pierre. It had to be a challenge cheering them on, knowing full well that their success would come at the expense of yours and vice versa. Friends, teammates, rivals, not an easy combination. How did you do it?
So, Paul, you say that I put team above all else. I often didn't. Mm-hmm. In the end, I did. In the big moments, I did. But it certainly, there was times where I didn't. There was times I had a lot of jealousy, a lot of envy. I think a goaltender is a unique position. It's like a quarterback in football. It's only one can play. So you're right. My main rivals were not the other team. My main rivals were my peers sitting in the dressing room with me. And so it was a unique relationship that, Shannon Sabatos came near the end of my career. So I had a different relationship with her, but Kim and Charlie were with me basically my entire career. And both are amazing people. Both are incredibly humble, hardworking, driven. And, had this situation been different and we met under different pretenses, we may have been best friends. But the way it was on the team is the coaches pit you against that other player. So you're fighting for that position with that player. Now, never a bad word was said between us. It's not like there was any ill intent, but it was really hard for me when they were chosen. And it was really hard for me to then not have these feelings, to constantly battle with, you want your team to not be able to go on without you. That's just a natural human emotion. But how do we come to a place where we can support? And all three of us had to do that throughout our careers. And I think, having watched them do that, at the 2002 Olympic Games, Charlene Labonte was the third goalie. And I watched her go through that. Now, I didn't have the empathy that I probably should have in those moments. I didn't necessarily understand what it took for her to put a smile on her face and be there for others. But when it came time for it to be my time to be the third goalie, I then understood. I then understood that it takes a certain strength, it takes a certain character to be able to do this, and that it is important. She could have gone the other way and she could have derailed the team. But when it was her time to start in the 2006 Olympic Games in Torino, I knew that I needed to be there to support her. And it wasn't an easy, suddenly you learn this amazing lesson. It's a lifetime of experiences that go into being able to find that strength. And I think we all have it within us if we're put in that position. We don't want to be put in those positions, but often we are. And somebody has to be in those positions. And it's, for me, what really helped was living vicariously through my teammates' big moments. So being genuinely really excited when they would make a big save. I can remember watching Kim St. Pierre in the final game in 2002 in Salt Lake City. And there was moments where I'd realize I wasn't playing. The coach would give this big pep talk in the middle of the period and everybody would be so excited to go on the ice and I would be going to the bench. There would be times where it was like this pit in my stomach. But as soon as the ref dropped the whistle, I was in it like a fan was in it. I was just, cheering at the top of my lungs. And I really felt like I needed to do that so that I was feeling it with my team, cheering for them and really supporting them in their big moments so that at the end of the game, we could stand on the blue line together to receive the gold medals. And it takes a lot to find your value, to find your place on a team. That's not easy, but I think it's an important story to tell because as athletes, as people, we often struggle with it and we often don't talk about it. And I wanted to talk about it so that people could find some value in that and realize that it's okay to have these feelings. But ultimately, we are in this together. And going through the pandemic like we are now, it really highlights that it is about those relationships. It's about supporting each other and getting through those small moments, and knowing when somebody else needs a helping hand as well, and being able to ask for it, I think is really important.
An interesting scenario was the time you and Kim were called into, I'm not sure whether it was Coach Sauvageau or Melody, but the two of you very uncomfortable beside each other, knowing one of you was not going to start. My gut wrenched for both of you. As a coach, would you have handled it that way, or was that the way it had to be handled?
So it's interesting because having now been on the flip side and doing this to players, there doesn't seem to be a good way. The U.S. national team, they used to bring everybody into a dressing room, and then Ben Smith would call out the names. And if your name was called out, you left. That means you made the team. And so whoever was left in the dressing room didn't make the team. Now, is that harder? Is that easier? That's like ripping the Band-Aid off. I don't know. Other times, and I talk in the book where Danielle Sauvageau or Mel Davidson would call us on the phone and be able to have a conversation. If you've made the team, you remember the call. If you've been cut, you don't remember what was said. And so, I think for the coach, you want it to be done in a positive way that the athlete, feels like they are of value. But I don't think there is any way to do it. I just don't think there's a good way to fire somebody that I've found. That doesn't mean that a couple of days later you can't follow up with a person and you can't, relate some experiences. But, was that terrible for her to bring us in together? I don't know. Looking back at it, it maybe made it easier for the coaching staff because then you don't have somebody breaking down in front of you. It made it maybe easier for us to relate to each other. It was just different than, other ways of doing it. I had my first year being the GM of the Toronto Furies, we had tryouts over the course of 2 weeks. All the girls had full-time jobs. We practiced until 11 o'clock at night, and the final cuts came at 11:30 at night. So could I have had a meeting with each individual, 40 players trying out for the team? No, I couldn't. So we had to put a list up. Now, is a list any better? No. I don't know. Then you have girls breaking down in front of the list. And, they had the opportunity to talk to the coach, but most don't want to at that point. So I don't know. It's, I feel like everybody has moments like that they question in hindsight what they maybe should have done. But I don't know that it was any more or better or worse than any other scenario that could have happened. So it certainly made for an interesting story, though.
Might have been 2005 prior to Torino. You find out you're going to be the third goalie, given all the work you've done. I think you hop into what you affectionately call your Mazda, the Blue Bomber, and you drive, and you don't really stop until you hit Saskatchewan. You just had to get away, didn't you?
It was, one of the hardest times in my life when I was told I was going to be the third goalie, because I just really, in my gut, in my heart, thought it would be different, felt it should be different. I don't think we become elite athletes unless we expect to play. And I don't think I would have lasted in the national team for such a long time unless I expected to be playing. Nobody should be okay with being a backup or a third goalie. Now, that's not to say that you can't still be positive. So when that was told to me, the hardest thing about the scenario, this is before social media or really before cell phones. I mean, you could kind of call people, but you couldn't text people. Right. The hardest thing for me was the embarrassment of it, having to tell people because nobody knew. My roommate, Jennifer Bottrell, was about to have her meeting with the coaches right after me. I didn't want to see her. I felt so embarrassed. I felt so like I'd let everybody down, that everybody that had put so much into my career, it was all for naught. And obviously being very emotional, but also being very shocked. Like this just can't happen this way. And in telling those moments, some of the gut wrenching moments of being told that you're not playing or being told you're the third goalie, it's like the death of it's a death of a dream, which is like the death of a person. I mean, you have to grieve it the same way. You have to go through all those emotions. And I want people to know when they are going through difficult times in their lives that it's okay. It's okay to grieve it. It's okay to do these crazy things like hop in a car and 16 hours later realize you're in a different province, because you don't have the perception, and I think that often we don't allow ourselves to grieve these moments, and we're guilt ridden over them. But I don't think unless you allow yourself to grieve, can you start to begin to the process of healing and the process of being in a support role as well. Had I not done that, and really just gotten away from everything, I don't think I would have been able to find the strength to then be in the third goalie position and be there for my teammates and be able to support Kim and Charlie as we went on this quest to win this Olympic gold medal. So we oftentimes in grief, I think, do crazy things, but certainly ending up in Moose Jaw was one of my craziest.
Didn't know it was there. In your book, we get a good idea of who Sami Jo Small is as you skillfully weave present and past. Swim practice at age 7 on those cold winter mornings in Winnipeg, provincial volleyball championships, badminton workouts, water polo, and those dreaded indoor cross-country workouts as a kid before school with your good friend Adam. What role did all these experiences play, do you think, in your success as a national team goaltender?
Well, I used to say that it's really important for kids to be well-rounded and do a lot of different sports, which I still think that is. I think being a good athlete is really important. But now that we live in the GTA, I realize just how hard that is. You get off work at 5 and you drive your kid to hockey, and it might be an hour away. You might have another kid that the other parent's driving them somewhere else. So to say to parents that your kids have to play multiple different sports, I think is maybe just not a reality in parts of this country. So what I now try to encourage people is to have balance. And that's not just for kids, but that's for adults as well. So to find something else that you're passionate about that, can take your mind away from things. I think the thing that playing a lot of different sports did for me was that I could never dwell on the past. You have a big game, you're excited. Well, 2 minutes later, you're in a car and you're driving to water polo practice and you're in a completely different role on that team. You have a bad practice. You can't dwell on that too long. You've let it, you got pulled from a game. You're on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So it made me a very even-keeled person, I think, an athlete, because, I could live that moment, be in the moment, and then quickly get into that next moment. I think how it directly related to me as an Olympic goaltender is in the specific moments in the book that I flash back. So I flash back to times that perhaps taught me a lesson as I was, living within these different sports that then related directly to being an Olympic goaltender. And there's so many lessons that you can learn from various different sports, but more important than that, about the different roles you play within these different sports. So a sport like cross-country running, where I was terrible, I did it and I got through it. And that ability to push through the tough times came to me later when it came time to test for the national team. Getting through things that you just don't like doing. This early morning swim practices, while I loved swimming, I did not like waking up in the mornings, and getting into the pool was my most dreaded thing. It was so cold, and my dad was my coach. It was just all around a terrible scenario. But I knew I needed to do it. I knew I needed to just jump in. And when I was told that I was going to be the backup in Salt Lake City, that's what I went back to. I went back to that moment of, how do you move forward? You just take that next step. You just jump in, and it might be terrible, but everybody else expects you to do this. So that's just what you got to do. And so there's so many moments that teach you such valuable lessons. And I think when we're pigeonholed into one sport, one activity, we often don't have that ability to learn as much because we're not in different roles. I think it's important to be a leader at times. It's important to be a follower. It's important to be a coach. It's important to be an administrator, to get the full perspective, to then be able to have empathy for those around us. I mean, what ultimately really what is sport? It's not life. it is a mechanism to learn about ourselves and to learn about the people around us and how to make our society as a whole better. And that's what sport really has taught me. And that could have been music. It could have been another sport. I think hockey just happened to be the sport because in Winnipeg we have a lot of ice. But it could have been field hockey. It could have been some other random sport, depending on what was important in my country or my family. And I feel like it just is important that people get out and do things and, find community and find a sense of value. And that's really what sport has provided for me.
You've had many female role models in your life, and they start with your family. Your grandmother growing up in a time where women's rights were about to turn the corner, Auntie Margaret Ann, and your mother, Pat, who embraced education. And of course, your dad, obviously, he was there as well, but you had a strong team in your corner, didn't you?
Yeah, and it's funny as a 44-year-old woman because I didn't realize that at the time. Growing up as a girl that got to play sports, I saw my mom unable to play, and I thought, oh, she's not an athlete. I thought she doesn't get me because she doesn't play sports. And in my mind, I just always thought she never wanted to. I never realized that she couldn't. And how she lived out her dream was to allow her young daughter to play. And I think every generation in female empowerment builds on the last. And I had no idea until I wrote this book that my Auntie Margaret Ann had played softball and was one of the best baseball players in the neighborhood. And that my dad always thought, well, she could do it, so why can't my daughter do it? I just had no idea. That was something that was never really talked about. I knew my Auntie Margaret Ann as, a mother to my cousins. It wasn't like something that was passed down to me. So I think the strength of women that were around me was just something that was so normalized, but that I didn't appreciate at the time because I saw them in these gendered roles. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and perhaps pigeonholed into a certain way of being as a woman in that era. Same with my grandmothers, that I didn't understand the challenges and the obstacles that they had to overcome to simply allow their young daughter to play. And so I now look back with such incredible gratitude that, that my mom and my dad had these amazing influences in their life, that they were empowered to think that their young daughter should be able to do whatever she wants to do. And that's not normal for most women of my generation. And most of my peers never got to play, not just hockey, but sport in general. So, coming from Winnipeg at that time, it just was not expected. And now we have a young daughter, and it's amazing to see that all of her peers are playing all these different sports. And that's just so normalized, And I guess my biggest regret is that the generation above me, my parents, my aunts and uncles, or my aunts and my grandmother, they didn't get to, be around teams and learn about themselves through sport and just to be fit and active. And it just wasn't expected, but they did have the wherewithal to pass that on to the next generation. So I'm pretty thankful.
Sami, you personify management, time management. You were also an elite track athlete and national renown in the javelin and discus, get you a scholarship to Stanford University. We're not talking an arts degree like I got at U of T. You were in mechanical engineering, and you also played on the men's hockey team. What an experience those 5 years must have been as you were going through the ups and downs of national team hockey, and you still got your degree.
It certainly was not easy. I was lucky enough to get into Stanford. And I guess I just didn't really understand at the time as a, kid coming from Winnipeg, being, a relatively big fish in a small pond, going to Stanford with some of the best and the brightest was just an absolutely amazing experience, but also so humbling. It certainly puts you in your place very, very quickly. And everything at Stanford is on a bell curve. So suddenly now you're being judged against the best in the world when it comes to academics. So there was times where I failed classes, where I was, embarrassed to tell people what my grades were. And it wasn't easy. I started in pre-med because I thought that's what smart people did, and realized that that really wasn't my passion, that I loved making things, and I found engineering. And it became my passion. It became what I love to do, but it wasn't easy. And I tell so many kids that it doesn't matter how many setbacks there are. It matters that in the end you're persistent and you get through it. And I did. I had to retake classes. I was often having to get tutors. I was, having to reach out for help. I had never done that before. So placing myself in a situation where I suddenly was not amongst the top was not easy, but it was, I think, an important transition for me into the real world, because here suddenly I think it's really important to learn new skills and to be able to learn new skills. And so unless you are kind of placed at the bottom of something at some point in your life, you're not going to know what that's like. You're not going to be okay with being embarrassed with maybe being the worst out there, but, constantly trying to get better each and every time. And going to Stanford was, for me, I think what allowed me to continue to play professional women's hockey into my 40s is that I was not burnt out of hockey. I played men's hockey there, which sounds great, but it's really just like a glorified men's rec league. It's like a beer league. We played in the Pac-10, but we had guys that had played NCAA hockey because there was no regulations at Stanford. So they had come to do their business degree or maybe medical degree. And then we had our second line of guys that maybe played in Minnesota or Canada. But our fourth line of guys had only ever rollerbladed in their entire lives. So it was really this eclectic crew. And for me, hockey became this sanctuary, this time away from being a full scholarship athlete to one of the best institutions in America. And the pressure was on track and field for me. It wasn't on hockey. Hockey was just a place where I could be me. Mm-hmm. And I think having that experience at that really opportune time in my life allowed me to see hockey for the joy. It was something that was just for me. And I continued to fall back on that joy whenever tough times came in the sport of hockey, because that's really why I played. I played for those moments where you're just on the ice and you're just playing with your buddies. And so had I not had that experience, I don't think I would have found so much joy in the game for such a long time. I think I would have been burnt out early, but I didn't. I stuck with it. And it was amazing to be there at the same time as people like Tiger Woods was there. Chelsea Clinton, who was the president's daughter, was there at the same time. It was really just an amazing institution. And so something I'm so grateful to have made this sort of deviation in my career, because it's given me lifelong friendships outside of the game of hockey that have given me a unique perspective on the world as well.
This was the best part for me. 97, you're a year away from graduating, everything's in place. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Hockey Canada gets a hold of you and says, hey, we need a third goaltender. And I forget what you said to your mother. I think I'm going to the Olympics, but it was a bippity boppity boo kind of moment, wasn't it?
For sure. I feel like my entire beginnings to my career were a bippity boppity boo scenario. I love that saying. That's great. From getting first seen by Wally Kozak in Calgary, him having to convince me to come to tryouts because I thought that this was just an old senile man thinking I had no idea Olympic tryouts were going on. Then being cut from that team, going back to Stanford, getting back into my education, getting back into track and field. And like you said, being then asked to join the team in Nagano and thinking it was a joke, thinking like, are you sure? Like almost I had to convince the coaches to then convince me. So it was a weird time in women's hockey when we didn't have scouts. We didn't have people across the country looking for that next player. Mm-hmm. Most of the women in my generation came out of the woodwork. And so you talk to a lot of the players on that very first women's Olympic hockey team, and their stories are so random, so eclectic, for lack of a better word. Danielle Goyette, who didn't start playing organized hockey till the age of 18 because she wasn't allowed. Or, France Louis, who at the age of 41 stuck with women's hockey so that she could skate on Olympic ice and see that through. Jennifer Bottrell, who at 17 years of age was the youngest player on that team, only made the switch from ringette at the age of 14, 3 years prior, and then made the Olympic team. Just these insane stories of the way we went about getting to that Olympic team will never happen again, because now there is the system across the country where players are, seen at a young age. There's the Canada Games or provincial teams. There's university hockey, under 18, under 22. But we certainly came at a time where I think it created these incredible characters of people. And that very first team, while we lost, I think those are really the true pioneers. Some of us were rookies. We didn't really know what was going on, but the France Louise, the Stacey Wilsons, Danielle Goyette, Geraldine Heaney, these women had fought for this right to play at the Olympic Games, and we got to be a part of their journey. We got to see them as role models and mentors and learn from them. And I say at the end of the book, a lot of these women may not have made the team in today's era with characters that were just so passionate and so forceful, and really wanting to evoke change within their families, their communities, within the nation. Now the players are, you have to sort of fit into the mold. You have to fit into the team. It's a much different era. And I think it made that era more fun because we had these just random off the wall characters within the team. And it really made the experiences really special to go through that with so many of these women that had just really fought for this right to play.
All right, let's get into the nastiness. Canada, USA. Handshakes after the round robin game against the USA. And you mentioned Danielle Goyette. She'd recently lost her father. But there's Sandra White, Harvard graduate, and allegedly some things are said, but the blood starts to get to boil. I mean, nice women and all, but I don't want to, there's no chauvinism here. I know what it's like out there for you people. This got nasty, not only physically, but verbally as well. And what do you recall from Sandra and just how bad Danielle felt playing, knowing that her father had passed away within weeks prior to?
Yeah, an amazing story of resiliency. Danielle Goyette's father actually passed away the day before the opening ceremony. So we were already in Nagano, and she had to make the really difficult decision to go home and be with her family or stay and play in the very first women's Olympic hockey tournament. And not an easy decision. She, in fact, missed the opening ceremonies. Stacey Wilson, our captain, stayed back with her in the village. It was not easy, obviously, going through all of that. When the game started and we played against the Americans, I don't know if you recall the 98 Olympics, but it was a 6-team tournament. So because it was the first time women's hockey was on the docket, they only allowed 6 teams. So we played each team once, with the final round robin game being against the Americans. Now, by the time we arrived at that final round robin game, we already knew we were playing the Americans in the final. So this was essentially a meaningless game. But there's never a meaningless game when Canada plays the US. So it was, fight to the death. We had taken a 4-1 lead into the third period, and the Americans ended up storming back to win 7-4. So it was a little bit of a derailment for our team. I'm gonna be honest. It was not easy for us to kind of go through the motions of losing 2 days before an Olympic final. Now, during that final, the handshake, there was perhaps some words said, perhaps some not words said. I don't know. We will never know. I mean, Danielle Goyette at the time was very francophone. Her command of the English language was very minuscule. That's not to say that American players and Canadian players did not chirp each other endlessly. But I don't know would somebody stoop to that level and say something about her father? I don't know. And I'm not going to, lay blame on Sandra White in that instance, but certainly Danielle Goyette felt it. She felt something in that moment, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps understood. And she was visibly distraught, in the dressing room afterwards. I think all of these emotions of just she was our leading scorer at the time, of carrying the team on her shoulders, came really full circle. And we had lost. So, sometimes you get injured in a game, but you win and you forget about the injury. I think when you lose, that injury hurts a lot more. And the same for these verbal onslaughts, and the fact that her dad had just passed away less than a week ago. she was definitely very distraught in that moment. And, you at the time in women's hockey, there was not much knowledge of the other team. So by the time the 2002 Olympics rolled around, Canada and the US, we played on the same club teams. We played on the same American university teams. Players were roommates with other people in college. We started to get to know the players. But the 98 Olympics, we didn't really know them. So there was this hatred unlike any other time, because it really was the opponent. You hated their team, you hated the players, and you knew nothing about them. You didn't really have a concept that they're the only ones in the whole world that understand what you're going through. And I think that that's where the friendship started to ensue later in my career, is because they're the ones that really know us the best. But at the time, we certainly did not feel that. There was a lot of animosity back and forth. And in the end, with the Americans winning in the final, it ultimately served them best. But I don't know, things like that. I don't know if they actually happened or not, but it certainly, I felt for Danielle in that moment, because whether Sandra Wright said it or not, the emotions of just losing her father was just astronomical. So the resiliency of somebody like her to still want to play in this tournament and represent the country in her dad's honor was pretty amazing to be a part of.
Well, there's nothing like motivation. Let's just fast forward 4 years later. And again, more controversy. Cassie comes into the room, I think after 2 periods, they're stomping on our flag. And we remember Haley talking with Grapes after the game. They stomped,
foaming from the mouth, right? As Haley's foaming. Yeah.
She was foaming.
Yeah.
Any truth to that there was a stomping?
I talk about that in the book about, and I work as a professional speaker. So giving, motivational speeches from the stage to corporations or associations. And that is still the most asked question at the end of my speech, is about the flag. Did it happen? So here's my take. Between the second and third period in the final game, Cassie, who, if anybody's ever met Cassie, is super passionate. Yeah. She is an incredibly motivating person. So she stands up and she tells this story about how the rink staff has told her about this scenario, how the Americans have our flag on their floor right in front of the gate. So every time that they walk towards the ice, they have to step on our flag. And that's so disrespectful, and we need to go out and show them. And at this point, we had just gone up 3-1. So Jana Hefford had just scored the big goal on a breakaway with a great pass by Becky Keller, and to take us up to 3-1 in the third period. So we needed something to just hold on. And that's the story that Cassie told. And we stormed out and we played just an incredible third period where penalties continued to be called against us, but we stayed together. And it was really because of moments like that we stayed together. We were all in it together. Now, after the game, we win, we celebrate, and immediately Haley finds, Don Cherry finds a cameraman. I think it could have been any cameraman at that point. And she tells a story on national TV. So then immediately the media go over to the Americans and ask, why did you have their flag on their floor? And the Americans looked bewildered and were like, well, we don't know what you're talking about. And so did it happen or did it not happen? I don't know. But I would like to think that similar to our team with great leaders, the Americans had Cami Granato, Karen Bai, Katie King. They had some incredible leaders on their team. And now every team that we've all been a part of has great leaders and has people at the other end of the spectrum that would likely do things like that. But I don't think that somebody like Cami would allow that to happen. And that was the year of the World Trade Center in 2001, just immediately prior. One of the American girls had lost their father in the World Trade Center. And some of the girls on the US team were asked to carry that tattered flag into the opening ceremonies. So they understood the importance of the flag, any flag. And I just don't think that they would have gone to that length to make that a public display like that. It certainly worked, though, for us. And whatever story that Cassie either saw, construed, or made up, it certainly motivated us to help us win a gold medal. So that's my take. I don't know what is real and what's not at this point.
Well said. Well, that final pits the two best teams on the planet, yet it was a display of endless special teams, which was absolutely brutal to watch. And I think back to Stacey Livingston. I'm still upset. I think the point 8 straight minors called against Canada. Is officiating for the women better than it was then? And I even look back to Sochi in 2014 and Joy Totman's goal or penalty call worked out well for Canada. We win on a power play in overtime. Even that could be disputed, especially if you're an American. Is the officiating better now, Sami?
So, interesting question. I get asked a lot about the officiating that game, but not about where it is today. But so backtrack to that game. Both coaches, Ben Smith and Danielle Sauvageau, had to agree on Stacey Livingston. So she had risen to the top as the best referee in that tournament, and they agreed that she would ref that game. And she was an NCAA established referee, and she didn't do well in that game. And I think that often we forget that these are real people, and watching the game. I had only watched the game one time. So after we got back from Salt Lake City, we had a team party, and everybody had to do a shot every time there was a penalty called. So I can't say I remember too much about watching it that time, but I did rewatch it several times for this book. And I didn't realize that the first 5 penalties went to the Americans. I didn't remember that as being part of the arc of the story. And then something like the next 12 going to us. Like it was, 6 for them, then like 12 for us. It was like insane, the amount for us. But you're right. It was all about specialty teams. And rewatching the game made me realize that there was lots of calls that were not called. It was incredibly intense. I mean, girls were open ice hitting each other and it wasn't getting called. Whereas others would have been an inadvertent trip where somebody steps on a stick and she would call the wrong person. So she would see a penalty here and then take the wrong number, somebody that was sitting on the bench. So things like that, to me, just when I look back at it, just seems like she was overwhelmed, that the pressure of the moment just got to her. And I don't want to take anything away from what she had done prior, because she obviously got herself into that position to be there, but she did not do a good job that game. Fast forward to where we are in 2020, and I can remember playing professional hockey, 2 years ago now, would have been my last year, and us still complaining about it. And I think the tough thing about reffing women's hockey is that we are, as players, they're still on a trajectory up. They are still continuing to improve. And there hasn't really been a plateau yet, because we haven't seen, this new generation of player is really the first generation that will grow up in a time where it's not only acceptable for girls to play hockey, but there are opportunities for camps, for special extra sessions, for players to really see how great they can become. This is the first generation. So these players are still going to continue to get better over the next decade. And the people that are reffing are generally the ones that stopped playing at one point or another. So they won't have the same speed or skill as the current players. And that's always tough. That was the toughest thing in women's hockey when I was playing, was the ability for a ref to keep up to the play was really hard. Once we got to a 2-woman system, that certainly did help. But we still don't have women that have played at the highest level that are reffing at the highest level. There are some, but that are not necessarily able to give their full time to the game of hockey. So somebody like Angela James, she reffed midget AAA boys. She reffed women's hockey, but she has 3 kids and she still coaches, and she's a Hall of Fame athlete. So she doesn't necessarily push herself to referee at the international level. So there's a whole generation, I think, of women that have to retire, have to raise their children, and then will become amazing referees, amazing coaches, amazing administrators. And that's not to say that women can't do it all and can't do it at the same time. I just think that there will be a whole new crop of people that have chosen maybe a different path for a little while their kids are young, who will be in their 50s and 60s now able to give back to the game in that way. So I await a time, people ask about, why are there not more female coaches? A, they're not getting hired, but also B, is they're just that generation that has played at a high elite level is still too young, in my opinion, to have time to give back in that way. And I think it's the same for refereeing in the women's game, is that we have some good refs within the game that maybe just don't have the time to really devote to the game, don't have the access, don't have the opportunities, and slowly refereeing will start to come along with hockey and will have the same expectations as the players. It's just not there yet, in my opinion, as a whole. That's not to say there's not the odd person, but as a whole. So it's something in hockey, I think, that in the women's side, just like the men's side, we're always going to complain about referees. Poor referees.
Always. It's a national pastime. We're going to end up on two final questions here. You've been so generous. So many moments preparing for those 2002 games. And the one that stands out for me is that cycling trip and the squirrel bike incident. You talk about you're an individual and you were selfish at times. You weren't in this case. Just briefly explain what was going on and how you dove on the proverbial grenade for the entire platoon.
So I think, every person has what I now refer to as their squirrel bike moment. So quickly to tell the story, we are on I think it was a 70-kilometer bike ride at the time. We did a lot of training on bikes to sort of build up our cardio base. And this particular one, we were in groups, 4 or 5 people. And our group was cycling along, and we came across the group in front of us who was, on their bikes were on the pavement. They were at the side of the road and in the middle of nowhere outside of the city of Quebec. So, we stopped to help them. What's going on? Trying to figure out what had happened. And poor Vicky Sanahara, who, if you've ever met Vicky, is just the biggest animal lover. She had run over a squirrel, and not just run over a squirrel, but it had lodged itself in the brake pads of her bike and had ground her to a halt. So Kelly Bouchard, who was biking behind her, felt the fur on her face as it was coming into her face. And it stopped the entire group. And then poor Vicky was, 100 meters further in front of the group, crying because she had murdered a squirrel, and she was just so devastated. And we still had 20 kilometers to go. So what do? There's 8 athletes from the two groups trying to get this squirrel out of this bike, trying to get Vicky to stop crying. And so in the end, it became my responsibility. I think half of the girls were grossed out and half were laughing so hard they couldn't even contain themselves. So I got this stick and I tried to poke the squirrel initially very tenderly, and then realized I just had to baseball bat it out of the brake pad. And then there was squirrel guts and blood all over the bike that Vicky refused to get on the bike. And she's like, there is no way. And so at this point I was exhausted and tired. And I was like, Vicky, just ride my bike. I will ride your squirrel bike. And she yelled at me the whole time to stay away from her. And don't get that stupid squirrel bike close to me. And so in the end, we all have our moments where we just got to jump on that squirrel bike for the betterment of the team. And had I not gone through that, I don't think I really would have understood how to support somebody. Sometimes it's those little things of just sucking it up and doing what nobody else wants to do to just get you home so that you can finally get some food and have a shower.
Endless situation here in this final question. Where are we now with professional women's hockey, and is National Hockey League backing essential to the success of professional women's hockey in North America?
So, Paul, you say that as if that's the last question. I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours about that. So that is the question in women's hockey right now, and it is not an easy answer. So I was a huge part of the CWHL, having started the last league that folded. And I think the biggest thing that that league folding did for the Canadian psyche was that it was seen as women's hockey not succeeding. And what I really want to separate from that is that it was a business that did not succeed. Women's hockey is stronger and better than it's ever been. The growth of the game is there. Women who never got a chance to play growing up are coming back into the game in huge boatloads at the age of 40, 50, 60 years of age. So all levels, I think, are really gaining strength, gaining traction. And at the elite level, what we are now going through is we are seeing suddenly two sides. One side being these players that were in the CWHL that the league folded, banded together to say, we want to come under the NHL umbrella. That's the Professional Women's Players or Hockey Players Association, PWHPA. So I see the validity in that. I see that they are standing up saying they deserve more. They want more. They want to be professional hockey players paid a livable wage. I get that. We have the other side of the coin of players that simply want to play. They're playing in the NWHL, which has now expanded to Canada and has a Toronto team. And that was a league that was started essentially to rival our league at the time. It was Danny Ryland started this league. She actually came to our board to put a team in New York City in that league. And we said we didn't have the money. So she went back and started an entire league. And a serial entrepreneur, I have nothing but respect for what she did, although she was, a thorn in our side for a long time. She created this league where she was the first person to be able to pay women to play hockey, which is pretty incredible. So this league still exists. The players on one side and the PW refuse to play there because they want to come under the NHL umbrella. These players that are playing here simply want to play and be paid to play. So they're making $15,000 to play. By no means is it a livable wage, but these players over here are going to sit out for 3-4 years. They're going to make 60 grand in that time. Is there a good solution? I don't know. Which as a fan now, simply, I want to see women's hockey. And I guess what I feel so terrible about is that on this side, you have the national team girls, but you have a lot of girls underneath them who the national team girls are paid to play. I mean, they can train full-time. They are full-time hockey players. That next level of players making this incredible sacrifice to be part of something bigger than themselves and may never get to play again. And that to me is incredible sacrifice. But it's also something that I see as so hard because for me, so many of my amazing moments happened with my club team of sitting on the bus, of vying for championships, of being down by a goal, of sipping from the cup. All those things happen with your club team, and these girls will not get to experience that. Now, it may be for the greater good, and I get that. So what I hope for the future of the game is that over here where you have all the talent, and over here you have all the money. You have lots of people putting a lot of money into women's hockey. These guys are waiting for the NHL to come on board, and these guys are just plowing forward. Is there a right thing? Is there a wrong thing? I don't know. I would love if the NHL just stepped up tomorrow and said, yeah, we're supporting women's hockey. But I guess what's really hard is within the game, we don't know. We don't know what the future is for Gary Bettman and for the NHL. Now, maybe they do within the PW. Maybe they do. But it is very clandestine to know as a fan for how to cheer. How can I lend my support to both sides? How can I support women's hockey at the elite level? And it's hard to not be perceived to have taking sides. So I'm hoping at some point these two sides can kind of come together in some sort of plan for the future, and that Gary Bettman can come out and say what he is planning, what the NHL is planning, so that these girls don't wait out for an eternity without a carrot at the end. I want something great to come at the end. And there's so many great minds within the game, so much skill, so much talent. The product is amazing. And I'm excited for what comes at the end. I just don't want to have to wait a decade for that to happen. Selfishly now as a fan, I want to see it next year. I want to be able to walk into a rink and see elite professional hockey with all the top players playing against each other. Now that's a lot to ask, and that's an easy solution. But I guess ultimately what I'm saying is there really isn't a solution right now, but that I want the best for the two sides, and would just love to hear what the NHL is thinking so that I can back whatever I need to back. I don't know if I said it right, but anyways, it's a big question in women's hockey.
And I can go on, and I'm not going to get into his USA past Canada hockey. I asked Wick that a year ago at Leaf rookie camp, and boy, oh boy, it's a convoluted question. The book is called The Role I Played, Canada's Greatest Olympic Hockey Team. So many stories, so much emotion, but Sami Jo Small takes the reader on a lifelong ride that was impossible to put down. Sami, thanks for this.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
You're listening to The First Question with Paul Hendrick, brought to you by Ballistic Sports. Follow Ballistic Sports on Twitter @Ballistic Sports.